The courtroom smelled of polished wood and old paper. The sunlight slipped in through tall windows, catching dust motes that floated like tiny, aimless ghosts. I stood just inside the doorway, feeling the floor cool beneath my shoes. Everyone's eyes were soft blurs at first, the kind you notice but can't really focus on. Except for one. The judge's eyes. They held something sharp, a weight that didn't belong to the rest of the room. I felt it before I saw it, a small tightening in my chest, the way your stomach knots when you remember a word you shouldn't have spoken. He looked at me like he might read the lines of my life off my face. I tried to straighten my back, tried to breathe quietly, evenly, like I had rehearsed in front of mirrors that didn't care. My hands rested lightly at my sides, but I could feel them trembling just beneath the surface. No one seemed to notice, or maybe they did and didn't care. The judge, though, his eyes lingered longer than anyone else's. I recited my statements, slowly, calmly, every word precise, every pause measured. But the sound of my voice felt strange in my own ears, like it belonged to someone else. The air in the room was thick, humming with a silence that had nothing to do with the absence of sound. It was the kind of silence that watches you. Outside, I could hear the faint echo of shoes on marble, a custodial mop squeaking against the hall, the ticking of a clock somewhere, regular and insistent. I wondered if he heard it too. Tick. The silence. Or if he only heard me. Memories surfaced unbidden. Teacher who asked too many questions. A policeman who glanced longer than necessary. My father's disappointed eyes. The way authority had always been a mirror I wasn't allowed to look into too closely. I swallowed, trying to push the past away, trying to keep the present safe. He cleared his throat once. Not loud, not a sound meant to interrupt, but enough to remind me that the world wasn't holding still for my breathing. I felt the tremor I thought I'd hidden rise in my chest, like a small, stubborn bird fluttering in a cage. Did he notice it? Could he see the tremor under my calm? I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself it was nothing. The murmurs in the courtroom had dulled, as if the room had collectively decided to watch and listen with bated breath. Chairs scraped softly on the wooden floor. Pens clicked, a paper rustled. Each sound felt like it might reveal something about me that I wasn't ready to share. I stared at the polished surface of the desk in front of me, tracing the knots in the wood, the tiny scratches that made the veneer imperfect. Small things. But they were mine to focus on, mine to hold on to while the world examined me. I noticed how the sunlight hit the edges of the judge's gavel, catching the faint scratches that spoke of years of use. I imagined how many decisions had been made with that tool, how many faces had passed under his gaze before mine. How many tremors had he noticed and ignored? I shivered, even though the room was warm, even though I told myself it was just air moving through cracks in the window. A young clerk shuffled papers behind him, her pencil tapping against a stack of folders. She didn't look at me. Nobody looked at me the way he did. And I didn't know if I wanted them to. There was something in the steadiness of his stare that felt like a question I couldn't answer. Something in it that made me aware of everything I'd hidden. I spoke again. My voice steadier this time, measured like a metronome. But I felt the small fracture inside me, the unspoken acknowledgement that this moment wasn't just about the words I said. It was about the ones I didn't. Every pause carried a weight, every breath felt deliberate. I could feel the judge's eyes tracing the edges of my posture, my hands, the slight quiver in my voice that I hoped had gone unnoticed. I remembered the last time someone had really looked at me the way I had frozen, unsure if I should run or stay. And I realized, I hadn't run. Not today. Not yet. I held my ground, silent as the walls around me. My heart beat like a secret drum, slow, steady, loud enough only for me to hear. He nodded once. Just a small, almost imperceptible nod, but it carried a weight. And for a second I thought he might know everything. But then he turned to his papers, and the weight shifted. The gaze lingered a moment longer, curious, maybe questioning, and then moved on. I exhaled quietly, almost too softly for anyone else to notice. The room's hum returned, Pens clicking, chairs scraping, murmurs rising. I took one more careful breath and let my gaze travel over the courtroom. The marble floor, the polished wood, the faces blurred with routine and expectation. Nobody else looked at me the way he did. And perhaps that was enough. Perhaps it was a warning or a question, or something I didn't yet understand. I stepped back, feeling the floor creak beneath my weight, like it remembered me. I felt small and yet present, in a way I hadn't expected. The judge looked down again, his pen scratching against paper, and I realized that this moment, this first tentative quiet encounter, was the kind that would echo. Not with noise but with memory. I left the courtroom slowly, each footstep measured, the sunlight stretching shadows long across the marble. The murmurs followed me, faint and distant, but I carried the gaze with me. Not like a burden. Not yet. Just a quiet reminder that someone had seen me, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't try to disappear. Outside, the air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of rain that hadn't fallen yet. I drew in a slow breath. The street felt empty, or maybe it just felt mine for a moment. I kept walking, my shoes pressing into the pavement, listening for the quiet echo of the judge's gaze behind me, lingering even as I moved away. And I wondered, did he notice the tremor I thought I had concealed? Or did he simply see me as I am? Careful, watchful, holding more than I let on, and quietly waiting for what would come next. The lobby smelled faintly of wax and old stone. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, cutting the dust-filled air into sharp slices. Every ray of light seemed to pause on the marble floors, glinting against scratches and worn edges, like the memory of footsteps long forgotten. I stood near the entrance, hands lightly clasped, watching. The world moved slowly here, measured by the scraping of shoes and the hush of whispered words. A janitor pushed a broom across the floor. Its bristles squeaked against marble in uneven rhythms. Each scratch, each tiny echo, reminded me that the building itself had seen more than I could imagine. People drifted through in muted colors. Suits, coats, scarves. They passed like shadows, faces blurred by urgency or distraction. None of them saw me, or perhaps they saw only the version of me I allowed them to see. I drifted forward, my shoes tapping lightly against the polished stone. The air carried the faint tang of disinfectant and paper, mingling with the soft warmth of the late morning sun. My gaze moved across the benches and the potted plants lining the walls. Every detail seemed sharper today, as if the lobby had grown alive with small, quiet intentions. The floor creaked like it remembered the steps of those who had come before. I noticed a newspaper lying abandoned on one of the benches. Its pages flared under the sunlight, headlines shouting silently across the lobby. I knelt slightly to glance at it. The words hinted at events I had hoped were safely locked away. My pulse caught. Could someone connect these stories to me? The question felt absurd. Yet I couldn't shake the prickling sensation crawling along my skin. Someone could be watching, could be reading, could be noticing. The shadows of people stretched across the walls in angles the sun could not have intended. They moved and flickered like smoke caught in a sudden draft. One man paused near a pillar, adjusting his tie, but he didn't meet my eyes. A mother tugged at her child's hand, their small footsteps echoing softly. And still, I felt the weight of a gaze I couldn't locate. Unseen. Ordinary. Precise. I shifted near the edge of the marble staircase. The surface reflected my shoes and the hem of my coat, a small, broken mirror of myself. For a moment, I imagined every person in the lobby piecing together fragments of my life. Tiny moments, tiny gestures, the way I smoothed my hair, the tilt of my head, the slow, deliberate steps. Could they guess the truth beneath the careful exterior? Could someone ordinary see who I really was without me ever speaking a word? A faint hum of conversation rose and fell like waves against the marble walls. The janitor paused, leaning on the broom for a moment, eyes distant. He didn't look at me, yet I felt his presence the way you feel a shadow across your shoulder. There was something quiet and deliberate in the way the lobby carried sound, a rhythm that both comforted and unnerved me. I sat on a bench, running a fingertip along the worn wood edge. The texture was rough under my skin, grounding me in the here and now. I glanced back at the newspaper, then at the people moving in the lobby. Everything was ordinary, and yet the ordinary pressed down with weight. Shadows flickered in corners. Light fractured against polished surfaces. The building whispered with quiet life, with things unseen but felt. A man in a gray coat brushed past me, his sleeve brushing mine lightly. Not a hand extended, not a glance, but still the brush sent a shiver through my spine. I looked up and he was gone, swallowed by the flow of people. My gaze drifted again to the sunlight across the floor, catching dust and small scratches that looked like scars. Every imperfection felt deliberate, as if the building itself remembered those who had moved through it, and those who had been hiding. The newspaper's headlines shifted under my eyes as a breeze from the open doors flicked the pages. One story caught me. Name, date, something I had thought forgotten. I pressed the edge of the paper lightly, pretending to smooth it flat. My heart beat quietly, but I knew it was audible to me alone. Could anyone else make the connection? Could someone see the careful construction of my life, the version I showed to the world, and still recognize the fractures beneath? I leaned back against the bench, listening to the subtle symphony of the lobby. Footsteps tap-tap-tapping. Low cough. The distant squeak of the janitor's broom. The air smelled faintly of coffee from a nearby vending machine. I could hear the soft whisper of the sun moving across the marble floor, and I felt small, and present, and entirely exposed, though no one else seemed to notice. The shadows shifted as people moved, stretching thin against the walls. I watched them, noticing the light on their shoulders, the tilt of their heads, the way they carried themselves through the space as if none of them had secrets at all. I realized then that everyone in the lobby had something hidden, some layer beneath the polished exterior. But mine felt heavier today, or perhaps it was simply sharper. Perhaps I was simply more aware. I rose slowly, my shoes sliding against the marble, and moved toward the grand staircase. My fingers brushed the banister lightly. Cold, smooth wood. I imagined the steps beneath, worn by decades of people like me, moving through the lobby carrying stories they couldn't speak aloud. I felt a quiet kinship with them, even as a private tension curled in my chest. For a moment I paused at the top of the staircase. The sunlight fractured across the marble, slicing shadows into jagged, imperfect lines. I looked down at the lobby below, and I felt the weight of unseen eyes again. Not threatening, not accusing, just watching. Ordinary perhaps, yet precise. And I realized that someone could see through the surface of a life I had so carefully curated. Could they see me? The me I hid even from myself. I stepped lightly down the first stair. The marble creaked faintly. The lobby's hum surrounded me. Shadows stretched long and thin, folding into corners and light. I touched the railing again, feeling the cold would steady me. The newspaper lay forgotten on the bench, a small reminder that even ordinary objects could carry stories, and that some stories had a way of finding you even when you hoped they wouldn't. Outside, the doors opened to a soft breeze, carrying city sounds, distant car horns, a bicycle bell, the faint murmur of voices. I paused for a moment at the threshold, sunlight brushing my face. The lobby behind me was quiet again, almost empty, yet heavy with the presence of all who had moved through it before. And I carried the feeling with me, that someone, ordinary and unseen, could piece together fragments of my life if they chose. I walked forward slowly, letting my shoes press against the concrete outside, the world stretching ahead in muted light. The shadows of the lobby lingered in my mind. The janitor's broom, the polished floor, the abandoned newspaper. And I thought quietly, almost to myself, can anyone really see who I am through the surface of a life carefully curated? The question hung in the air as I moved away, and I realized it might not be answered today. Or perhaps it had already been, in a glance, in a brush of air, in the way the shadows remembered my presence long after I had left. The apartment smelled faintly of old books and the faint tang of damp air. Rain tapped lightly against the window pane, a soft, uneven rhythm that pressed against my thoughts. I sat on the edge of the bed, fingers tracing the worn wood frame, listening to the sound. Outside, the city blurred behind sheets of water, a gray watercolor of streets and lights. The world felt muted, hushed, as though it had been holding its breath. I reached for the drawer, the one I hadn't opened in years. Its paint chipped at the corners, splintered where I had forced it closed too many times. My fingers brushed against the edges of the paper inside, and I hesitated. The envelope was yellowed, fragile. The ink had bled slightly with time, smudged in the places where it had been handled most. I lifted it carefully, as though it might crumble, and held it against the dim light of the single lamp in the corner. The letter carried a name I hadn't spoken in decades. A life I had buried beneath layers of careful anonymity. I traced the familiar loops of the handwriting, and a memory pressed against my chest, sharp and aching. The night I wrote it, the rain had been heavier. I remembered the sound, the rhythm against the roof, the way it had mirrored the quiet terror in my heart. I unfolded the paper slowly, my eyes scanning the words that once felt alive, that once held everything I was too afraid to admit. My thumb brushed a smudged word, and I could feel the pulse in my fingers, like the letter was beating under my touch. The sentences carried both confession and fear, truth and concealment intertwined. Reading it again, I realized how carefully I had tried to protect myself. And yet, protection had never meant freedom. The rain against the window became louder, insistent, like a quiet drumbeat marking the hours I had tried to erase. I pressed my forehead lightly against the top of the drawer, the letter still open in my hands. My heart fluttered, a small, relentless bird trapped behind ribs. Should I confront what I had written all those years ago? Should I let the memory rest where I had left it? The question trembled in the silence between the drops. I remembered the night the words were penned. The streetlights had shimmered on wet pavement, the neon reflecting against puddles. I had been careful then, so careful. Yet even in my vigilance, the letter had captured me. Every fear, every hope, every fragment of who I had once been. Holding it now, I felt both that same fragility and the strange weight of survival. I had survived, yes. But at what cost? The apartment grew darker as the storm pressed on. Shadows pooled in the corners, folding over familiar furniture and stretching across the floor. I felt them move like soft hands over my shoulders, pressing me into memory. I remembered the fear of being discovered, the way I had wrapped myself in ordinariness, in routine. The letter was proof that the truth could not be entirely erased. That part of me still existed, still waited. I ran a finger along the smudged ink again, pausing over a word that had once seemed impossible to write. The letters blurred slightly as my eyes misted. I had hidden this life, hidden myself, but I could not hide the feeling it stirred, the sharp ache of remembrance. I wondered if anyone else could feel it too. Could anyone who found this letter understand the person I had been, or would they only see the shadow I tried to leave behind? A breeze rattled the window slightly, carrying the distant smell of wet asphalt and the faint echo of voices from below. The city seemed alive, indifferent and intimate at once. I leaned back against the wall, cradling the paper in my hands like a fragile child. I could feel the weight of years pressing into it, the history I had folded between the lines. And in that moment, I realized the letter was not just a memory. It was a mirror. The rain softened, a gentle patter now, as if it had exhausted itself. I pressed the letter to my chest, letting the warmth of my body cradle it. I could feel the pulse of my own life reflected back, fragile but insistent. The words were still there, stubborn in their permanence, refusing to disappear despite the passage of time. I thought of all the ways I had hidden from myself, all the careful steps I had taken to remain unseen. I placed the letter gently on the bedside table, careful not to disturb the fragile folds. The paper lay there, still carrying the weight of the person I had been and the life I had tried to construct over it. I sank to the floor, letting my back rest against the bed frame, feeling both exposed and strangely grounded. The apartment smelled faintly of rain, of paper, of something I could not name, perhaps recognition. For a long moment, I listened to the storm outside, the soft rhythm of drops against glass, the quiet hum of the city continuing beyond my walls. And I thought about the choices I had made, the identity I had curated so carefully. The letter reminded me that the past was never truly silent, never truly gone. It lingered in corners, in folds of paper, in moments of quiet reflection like this one. I stood slowly, fingers brushing the edge of the table. The letter waited for me there, patient, unjudging. I realized that confronting it was not about fear, but about acknowledgement. About recognizing a part of myself I had thought long buried. The storm outside had slowed to a gentle drizzle, and the world felt quieter, more intimate. I touched the paper lightly one last time before closing my hand over it. My heart still fluttered, but it was steadying. I could feel the weight of what had been hidden and, somehow, the fragile release of having it acknowledged. The apartment, the storm, the faint hum of life outside. All of it seemed to pause for a breath, leaving me alone with the quiet truth of the letter and the life it held. I walked to the window and watched the city below, droplets racing down the glass. The letter waited, patient and still, a fragment of the past that could not be destroyed, only carried. I whispered to myself softly, almost without knowing it, maybe some truths are meant to sleep. Maybe some truths are meant to be held, quietly, until you are ready. And for now I was not ready. The subway smelled of damp metal and stale coffee. Fluorescent lights flickered above, casting long, uneven shadows across the peeling walls. I stood near the doors, my hand resting lightly on the cold pole, feeling its smoothness under my fingers. The train rattled and groaned along the tracks, carrying bodies pressed into the rhythm of motion, heads bowed, eyes down. Everyone was a blur of gray and brown. Everyone except the whisper. It came from behind me, soft and fleeting. A voice I hadn't heard in decades, curling around my spine like smoke. I didn't turn. I could feel it brushing against my ear, brushing against memory. My heart stuttered, and my pulse felt loud in the sudden silence I made for it. The city outside streaked by in a blur of gray, windows catching reflections of my own hesitant movements. I wondered if it had been intentional, if someone had recognized me, or if it was simply coincidence, a trick of the mind. My hands tightened lightly on the pole. The train clattered over the tracks, each jolt sending a tremor through the floor and into my bones. The shadows of passengers stretched and bent with the motion, elongating unnaturally along the walls, reminding me that the past never truly dies. I tried to focus on the motion of the subway, the rhythm of the tracks, the hum of the train's engine. But the whisper lingered, tangled with memory. I remembered a night long ago, a rain-soaked street, a hurried step, words spoken in urgency and fear. The city had been quieter then, smaller. I had been smaller. And now, decades later, it returned in the shape of a fleeting voice, too soft to catch, yet impossible to forget. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, trying to anchor myself in the present. The other passengers pressed around me, anonymous and indifferent. Their jackets brushed mine. Their briefcases knocked lightly against my leg. Nobody looked. Nobody noticed. And yet, I felt a presence behind me, watching me, tracing my edges in ways I had long forgotten were visible. Could someone see through the layers I had built? Could someone recognize me even now? A hand grazed my shoulder as someone passed. Not a touch of malice, not of intent, but enough to send a shiver down my spine. I exhaled slowly, pretending to adjust my bag, pretending the world was ordinary. The train lurched and screeched against the rails, shadows bending over the seats, folding into themselves. I realized the shadows themselves seemed longer today, pressing against me, leaning closer, as if they carried the weight of memory with them. I leaned against the pole, listening to the city rumble beneath the tracks. The whisper replayed in my mind, a single phrase tangled in the fog of time. I couldn't place it entirely, couldn't locate the voice in space, yet it pressed on me like a fingerprint on glass. The subway's fluorescent hum was loud now, buzzing in my ears, masking everything but the ghost of a sound that refused to be dismissed. I watched the reflection in the window as the train passed through a dark tunnel. My own face stared back, half hidden in shadow, distorted by the curve of the glass. I studied it carefully. Lines I had earned. Eyes I had tried to hide behind. And the weight of anonymity I had clung to for years suddenly felt fragile, a thin veneer over everything I was. Could someone pierce it with a single word? Could a whisper undo decades of careful concealment? The train slowed at the next station. A crowd poured in, faces and bodies pressing closer, shadows folding into shadows. The whisper didn't return. But the impression remained, lingering like smoke in the corners of my mind. I clutched my bag a little tighter, feeling the texture of the worn leather, grounding myself in the tactile present. My heartbeat had slowed, but the tremor in my chest hadn't left. I stepped off at my stop, the platform damp and smelling faintly of rain from the tunnels above. Water dripped from the ceiling onto puddles that reflected the flickering lights, fractured like memories. I walked along the edge of the platform slowly, letting the echo of my shoes mingle with the hum of the station. Shadows stretched in long, crooked angles, reminders of the whisper that had brushed past me. A reminder that the past doesn't vanish simply because we wish it to. I paused near a vending machine, listening to the soft hiss of soda cans sliding down. I thought of the decades I had spent folding myself into shapes that couldn't be seen, voices I had muffled, faces I had avoided. And now, a single phrase, spoken and lost in the crush of passengers, had returned. It was small, insistent, and heavy all at once. A gentle tremor reminding me that hiding never truly makes you invisible. The subway rattled on behind me, carrying strangers and stories in a rhythm I had once moved within unknowingly. I pressed my hand to the cold metal of the vending machine, tracing its ridges with my fingers. My breath fogged the glass for a moment, and I watched the condensation drip in tiny lines to the floor. I remembered the night I had first chosen to disappear into the ordinary, to leave someone behind, to cover a life with silence. And now, a whisper had found me again. I walked toward the stairs slowly, my shoes clicking softly against wet concrete. My reflection caught in the polished handrail, a figure ordinary and careful, yet haunted in subtle ways. Could someone recognize me through the cracks in the veneer I had built? Could a voice, soft and nearly forgotten, undo the careful anonymity I had cultivated for years? I didn't have the answer. I only had the feeling that something had shifted, like a door opening quietly. Just a crack. The stairs led to the street, and rain was falling steadily now, soft at first, then insistent. The city smelled of wet asphalt, diesel, and something I couldn't name. I pulled my coat tighter, listening to the rain drum against the fabric. The whisper lingered in my mind, a ghost tracing my edges, reminding me that the past never truly sleeps. It waits in corners, in echoes, in brushed shoulders. And I had felt it, almost tactile, almost alive. I stepped into the gray blur of the city, watching faces move past me, umbrellas cutting arcs of color against the gloom. None of them seemed to notice, and yet I felt the weight of what might have been, the recognition, the understanding, or simply the coincidence of memory brushing against memory. Shadows folded behind me as I walked, long and patient, and I wondered quietly, almost to myself, had someone truly recognized me, or was it only my imagination whispering back? The rain softened as I moved down the street, puddles reflecting the diffuse city lights. The subway's rumble faded, replaced by distant horns and the occasional footsteps of night shifters. And I carried the whisper with me, tucked somewhere under the careful layers I had built. A gentle, haunting reminder that no matter how far I ran, the past could still reach out. And perhaps one day it would not let me go. The courthouse smelled faintly of paper, polish, and the echo of footsteps. Sunlight slanted through high windows, scattering across marble floors in fractured beams. Each corridor seemed longer than it should be, lined with doors that held their own quiet histories. I moved slowly, heels clicking against polished stone, listening to the hollow echo like a heartbeat I wasn't sure I wanted to follow. I paused at a corner, fingers brushing the wall as though it might steady me. The air was cool and faintly musty, carrying the weight of decisions and secrets. The hum of the building was soft, the whisper of ventilation, the distant murmur of clerks behind closed doors. And yet, each sound felt deliberate, a rhythm I could not ignore. I wondered if anyone noticed me, or if I had become just another shadow moving through the halls. I approached the file cabinets lining the far wall. Their metal faces were worn, corners chipped, labels faded with age. The scent of dust and authority rose when I pressed my hand against one. I ran my fingers over the drawer pulls, pausing at each one. Every cabinet held a fragment of someone's life. Decisions, mistakes, confessions, the weight of a past carried silently in paper. And I knew that somewhere among these, pieces of my own life might still linger. A drawer caught slightly as I opened it, reluctant under years of use. Papers shuffled inside, whispering faintly. One file tipped, slipping out, landing on the floor with a soft thud. Froze. It was addressed in familiar handwriting, ink slightly faded but still legible. My pulse quickened. I knelt slowly, heart tucked against ribs that refused to stay still, and picked it up. The paper smelled of dust, of confinement, of memory pressed into print. I opened the file carefully. Names, dates, places. Fragments I had thought erased. Each word landed with a subtle weight, each sentence a reminder of the life I had worked so carefully to obscure. I traced a name with my fingertip, feeling the texture of the ink beneath my skin. The dates matched nights I had tried to forget. The addresses lined up with streets I no longer walked. It all screamed at me softly, insistently, like a memory demanding attention. I stepped back, holding the file close to my chest. The corridor seemed to stretch, silent but heavy, as though the walls themselves were waiting. I pictured the judge, his gaze sharp and deliberate, evaluating everything I presented. Would he see the fragments in these files the way I did? Or would they remain just paper, invisible to everyone but me? I shifted my weight from one foot to the other, trying to anchor myself in the ordinary rhythm of the courthouse, while the extraordinary pressed against my mind. I rifled through the loose pages, careful not to tear them. Each scrap revealed more. Letters, brief annotations, dates meticulously noted, some crossed out, some underlined. The ink seemed alive, a muted scream echoing through the quiet hall. I could feel my own heartbeat rising, a slow, insistent drum. Every fragment reminded me how carefully I had lived, how every step had been measured, every word chosen. And now, the past seemed to press against the present, asking for acknowledgement. A clerk passed in the distance, pushing a cart with files. He glanced at me briefly, then continued, unaware of the life unraveling silently in my hands. I leaned against the cabinet for support, feeling the cool metal under my palms, grounding me. The paper trembled slightly in my grip, and I realized I had been holding my breath. I exhaled softly, letting the sound echo in the empty corridor. The pages fell open to a fragment I had hoped never to see again. A note, written in my own hand decades ago, carefully hidden, carefully sealed. I pressed it to my chest for a moment, letting the weight of both time and intention settle there. Each word carried both confession and fear, the sort of truth that had been buried but never truly gone. And I felt the delicate ache of recognition, both mine and the building's, silent witness to every careful concealment. I moved to return the files to the drawer, but hesitation caught me. The weight of these papers was heavier than the file cabinet could hold. They were alive with memory, with choices, with consequences I had spent years trying to outrun. I imagined the judge flipping through them, noting the inconsistencies, the fragments of identity I had hidden so carefully. My chest tightened, a small, steady tremor I could not hide. The corridor seemed to breathe around me, the polished floors reflecting light and shadow in ways that made the hall feel larger, older. I traced a finger along the edge of the cabinet, feeling its cold, worn surface beneath my skin. The courthouse held centuries of lives like this, quiet, contained, folded into folders. And now, mine had emerged in fragments, delicate and insistent, whispering of decisions I could not take back. I exhaled slowly, pressing the file to my chest one last time before tucking it under my arm. The air smelled faintly of paper, dust, and rain that had leaked in from outside. I walked down the corridor, each footstep deliberate, echoing softly against the walls. The shadows shifted with the afternoon light, long and patient, reminding me that the past moves differently than we do. Wait, it lingers. And it remembers. At the end of the hall, I paused by a door, the brass handle cool under my hand. I imagined opening it, the judge's gaze meeting mine again, and the file revealing what I had long concealed. The weight of possibility pressed against my shoulders. I wondered if the past in those pages would change how he saw me, or if the truth would remain buried beneath the carefully measured steps I had taken all these years. I moved on slowly, each step a quiet negotiation between the life I had built and the fragments resurfacing in my hands. The courthouse hummed softly around me, the echo of my movement mingling with distant footsteps and the faint murmur of voices behind closed doors. Every sound felt deliberate, every shadow a gentle reminder that nothing truly disappears. I reached the stairwell leading down, the file tucked carefully beneath my arm. Sunlight flickered across the walls, fractured through the narrow windows, painting the steps with long, broken stripes. I took a slow breath, feeling both the tension and the fragile release of holding the past so close. And I realized that no matter how carefully I had hidden, some truths have a way of finding you, even decades later. I descended the stairs, the echo of my shoes mixing with the distant hum of ventilation and the subtle creak of the building settling. The file pressed against my side, a tangible weight of years and choices. And as I reached the bottom, I whispered softly to myself, almost inaudible, "Some things are meant to remain hidden. But some things will always find a way to be seen." The sky was dark and low, the kind of heavy gray that presses down even when the clouds don't move. Rain fell in thick sheets, hammering the stone steps of the courthouse with a rhythm that felt like judgment itself. I stood at the top, coat soaked through, collar turned up, and let the cold seep into my shoulders. Lightning arced across the sky, momentarily illuminating the grand pillars, casting them as solemn sentinels against the storm. Each flash painted the building in stark white, a monument to authority, to scrutiny, to memory I thought I had left behind. I moved down the steps slowly, boots splashing in shallow puddles. Water ran along the grooves in the stone, carrying reflections of the courthouse's looming columns. My hand grazed the wet surface, tracing the smooth, slick edges. I felt the chill in my bones, but the cold was nothing compared to the memory pressing against my chest. The judge's glance returned to me in fragments. Sharp, deliberate, lingering longer than it should have. I could feel it even now, like a pulse echoing through the rain. The wind whipped around me, tugging at the hem of my coat and biting at my ears. Each gust carried the smell of wet asphalt, distant exhaust, and something faintly metallic from the courthouse walls. I held my bag tightly, fingers curled around the strap as if it could anchor me against both the storm and the memory. The world blurred around me, streaks of headlights on wet streets, umbrellas bobbing like dark flowers, the occasional pedestrian moving hurriedly to escape the downpour. And yet, in that blur, I could not escape the clarity of what I had felt inside the courtroom. I stopped halfway down the steps, letting the rain wash over my face. I closed my eyes and tried to slow my heartbeat. Each flash of lightning sharpened the pillars again, drew attention to the weight of the structure, and in my mind to the weight of judgment I carried. The city was quiet compared to the storm, distant murmurs of traffic and the occasional shout swallowed by the patter of rain. I replayed the judge's glance, the subtle narrowing of his eyes, the tilt of his head. Who could see beneath the surface of all I had prepared, all I had hidden? I remembered the papers I had handled earlier that day, the hidden files, the letters tucked away. Each one a fragment of a life I had tried to keep contained. The rain seemed to echo them, tapping insistently on the stone, relentless, refusing to be ignored. I pressed my hand to the column beside me, feeling the rough texture under my fingers, cold and unyielding, and I felt myself pressing against the same weight, the impossibility of hiding entirely. The storm was a mirror, relentless and honest. I continued down the steps, boots making soft splashes, puddles rippling outward. Each step felt heavier than the last, not from the rain, but from the awareness that someone might notice. The memory of the judge's glance tugged at me, not accusatory, not kind, but exact, precise, unforgiving in its clarity. I wondered if it was possible to live carefully enough, to prepare enough, to hide well enough that no one could see the truth beneath years of careful construction. A clap of thunder rolled across the city, shaking the stone beneath me. Lightning flashed again, briefly illuminating the faces of passers-by, their umbrellas like dark halos in the storm. For a moment, I felt their anonymity, their casual detachment. And yet, in that brief flash, I felt seen, as though the rain and lightning had conspired to remind me that exposure can happen even without intent. A fragment of fear prickled at the back of my neck. Had someone noticed? Could someone still? I reached the bottom of the steps and paused, letting the rain stream down my back. Water ran into my boots, cold against my toes, soaking through my gloves. I folded my arms loosely, hugging the coat closer, feeling the pressure of both storm and memory against me. I replayed the courtroom once more, each flash of the judge's glance cutting sharper than the wind. I wondered if his eyes had lingered on something more than the paper, on something I had tried to hide. The tremor in my voice, the hesitation in my hands, the fragments of truth I thought carefully concealed. The street lights glimmered against the wet asphalt, blurred by the rain. Cars passed slowly, their headlights carving paths through the gray. I took a tentative step forward, letting water run down the back of my coat, feeling the cold settle into my chest. Each breath came visible in the chilled air, small clouds that vanished almost immediately, fragile as the anonymity I clung to. Shadows flickered around me, distorted by the rain and light, folding in on themselves like reminders of the past, of moments I could not unsee. I walked along the sidewalk, the courthouse rising behind me in monumental silence, rain still hammering against stone, pillars stark against the stormy sky. Every flash of lightning seemed to cast long, patient shadows across the steps I had descended, shadows that felt like they were observing, weighing, remembering. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling the pulse beneath the wet fabric, and I thought of all the careful measures I had taken to remain unseen. And yet, the truth had a way of moving through water and stone. It arrived in glances, whispers, papers, and now, in the relentless rhythm of rain. I realized that even the storm seemed to demand acknowledgement, to insist that hidden fragments of the past could not remain entirely buried. My steps slowed, soaking boots squelching against the pavement, the echo of each footfall merging with the distant rumble of thunder. I stopped at the edge of the street, watching rain smear the city lights into pale reflections on puddles. My hair clung to my face, dripping, plastered to my cheeks, and the cold stung lightly. I took a long, deliberate breath, letting the rain carry away some of the tension, though the memory of that glance lingered like the storm itself. Sudden, insistent, impossible to ignore. I looked back once at the courthouse, pillars stark against the sky, rain streaming down in relentless sheets. It was beautiful in its severity, harsh in its light and shadow, monumental in ways that felt both protective and accusatory. And I whispered softly to myself, almost unheard over the rain, the past never truly leaves. It waits in stone, in shadow, in fleeting glances. And maybe, just maybe, someone always notices. I turned and continued walking, water pooling at my heels, lightning carving pale lines across the sky. Each step was deliberate, measured. I held the memory of that glance close, pressing it beneath the wet fabric of my coat, knowing that the storm, like the truth, would follow in its own time. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and dust, the kind of smell that held memory in its fibers. Sunlight fell through tall windows in slanted streams, cutting across the benches in stripes of gold and gray. I sat in the corner, back straight but shoulders tight, listening. The air was quiet but not empty. It vibrated with echoes, distant voices, long past murmurs of verdicts rendered and lives changed. Each one seemed to brush against me, as if the walls themselves remembered. I pressed my fingers to the edge of the bench, feeling the warmth of the varnish beneath the cold of my skin. My heart beat a slow rhythm that felt deafening in the hush. People moved through the room with routine, indifferent gestures. Clerks shuffled papers. A bailiff stepped lightly across the polished floor. And yet every small sound, a cough, a shuffle, a page turning, felt magnified. I could almost hear the whispers of names I had hoped were forgotten. Each syllable seemed to echo in the grain of the wood. The judge sat behind the bench, reviewing my file with the weight of authority. His brow furrowed, fingers tapping lightly on the polished surface, eyes scanning inked details that I had tried so hard to control. I watched him, almost unnoticed, my own gaze tracing the line of his jaw, the slight tilt of his head. He didn't look at me yet, not directly, but I could feel the precision in his observation, the way he measured every movement, every pause. And I knew that beneath his practiced calm, he was searching for something I had spent years burying. I breathed slowly, letting the air fill my lungs, trying to anchor myself in the rhythm of ordinary things. The click of a pen, the soft shuffle of papers, the distant murmur of a clerk's voice. And still, the courtroom seemed alive with memory. I imagined the verdicts that had come before, voices raised in judgment, sighs of relief, tears shed quietly on polished benches. I could hear them, just beneath the surface, carrying the weight of consequences I had narrowly avoided. The past pressed against me softly, insistently. I shifted slightly, careful not to draw attention. My hands rested on my lap, trembling only slightly, though I thought I had concealed it. The judge's eyes lifted briefly, and I held my breath, pretending to be absorbed in the sunlight streaming across the floor. I imagined the reflection of my own face in the polished surface of the bench. Tense, alert, contained. I had rehearsed every motion, every gesture for years. And yet, the echoes of history seemed to seep through the room, reminding me that preparation alone could never erase memory. A clerk handed a document to the judge. The paper whispered against the surface of the desk. My gaze followed every movement, noting the crease of his brow, the subtle tightening of his jaw. I traced the pages in my mind, remembering the hidden files, the letters I had handled, the fragments of identity I had hoped were lost. And now, all of it was here, visible in print, yet invisible in ordinary sight. The walls held the stories, the verdicts, the echoes of decisions long past, and I felt the tension of being both unseen and exposed at once. The judge looked up finally, eyes meeting mine briefly. Not accusing, not questioning, just observing. That small contact made the air feel heavier. I realized I had been watching him almost as closely as he watched me. Each micro-expression, each subtle shift in posture, carried meaning. And I wondered, would he notice the tremor in my hands, the hesitation in my breath, the faint tension that had no place in ordinary life? Or would it all pass as just a quiet presence, unremarkable, contained? I felt the weight of all the people who had come before me, seated where I now sat, their stories folding into the very walls. The echoes of verdicts, some whispered, some shouted, hung like a fine mist over the benches. Each one reminded me that truth is often layered, hidden beneath gestures, documents, and the quiet pauses between words. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling the pulse beneath my coat, and imagined those voices brushing against the edges of my identity. Each one a reminder that concealment is never absolute. The room seemed to contract slightly, the light dimming as clouds passed over the tall windows. Shadows stretched across the floor, folding and bending like memories themselves. I straightened in my seat, folding my hands, the file of my life hidden carefully in my bag. The judge's gaze returned to the pages, his fingers tapping softly on the wood, a rhythm that matched the tension coiling in my chest. I could feel the quiet negotiation, between what was hidden and what might be seen, between what was controlled and what had slipped through the cracks of my careful life. I exhaled softly, letting my breath fill the small space of silence around me. The murmurs of distant voices continued, faint and indistinct like ghosts. My heartbeat slowed slightly, though the undercurrent of tension remained. I imagined the courthouse walls absorbing the whispers, storing them, holding every story in the grain of the wood, the polish of the benches, the echo in the vaulted ceiling. And I realized quietly that no matter how hidden we think we are, walls remember. They carry the echoes of all who came before. The judge finally lifted his eyes from the file, and the moment stretched. A faint sound, the turning of a page, punctuated the stillness. I could feel the space between us, the unspoken knowledge that something important was at stake, though no words had yet been spoken. I pressed my fingers together in my lap, feeling the pulse of tension and release, the delicate balance between concealment and exposure. And I knew, in the quietest part of myself, that this room, these walls, had seen far more than I would ever reveal. I leaned back slightly, letting my shoulders relax just enough to catch the rhythm of ordinary life again. The murmur of clerks, the faint scrape of shoes, the soft hum of ventilation. And yet, the echoes persisted, lingering like smoke in corners, reminding me that each verdict leaves a trace, each observation leaves an imprint. The past does not vanish. Wait. Echoes. I exhaled one last time, soft and deliberate, letting the room hold me in its quiet weight. The judge looked down again, pen moving across the page, unaware of the small tremor I felt in my own chest. I wondered, almost to myself, would he uncover what I have spent so many years concealing? Or would the echoes remain just that? Echoes, faint and distant, only I could hear them. The sunlight shifted across the floor, golden stripes bending into the shadows of benches and pillars. I pressed my hands lightly against my knees, leaning forward just slightly, letting the quiet of the courthouse envelop me. The air was still, heavy with history, with memory, with anticipation. And I realized that even as I sat quietly, my presence nearly unnoticed, the echoes of verdicts continued to move, shaping me in ways I could not fully see. The hallway was quiet, dim light pooling unevenly across the worn tiles. Shadows stretched along the walls, folding into corners where the fluorescent bulbs faltered. I leaned against the cool plaster, shoulders hunched, letting my eyes trace the cracks in the paint, the faint scuff marks that had grown over decades. The building seemed to exhale softly, as though it had been waiting for someone to speak. I waited too, waiting for myself to admit what I could not. My reflection caught me in the small square of glass near the stairwell. A stranger stared back, a face I recognized and yet had hidden for so long. I studied it carefully. The set of my jaw, the tension in my shoulders, the quiet lines that told stories I had never told. I imagined the words forming in my mouth, rehearsed and precise, each syllable carrying the weight of years spent in careful concealment. My hands tightened into fists, nails pressing against palms, trembling from the effort of restraint. The silence in the hall was complete. No footsteps, no distant voices, only the faint hum of ventilation. I could feel the weight of the walls pressing close, as though they too knew the secret I carried. I thought of all the moments I had avoided this, the letters tucked away, the files hidden, the eyes that might have glimpsed a hint of what I had become. And now, here in this quiet corridor, I confronted it, alone but entirely visible to myself. I imagined speaking aloud, letting the confession roll from my lips, slow and deliberate. Each word would unravel layers I had meticulously constructed, the life I had curated, the name I had changed, the choices I had made to remain unseen. But when I opened my mouth, the words refused me. They clung to the back of my throat, heavy and unyielding. Silence swallowed them, and I swallowed with it, heart hammering softly in my chest, each beat a reminder of the life I had kept hidden. The light flickered again, briefly illuminating my reflection in harsher clarity. I saw the small quiver in my hands, the faint tension in my eyes, the way my lips pressed together as though to hold back a flood I could not control. The building felt colder now, each draft slipping under the doors and along the baseboards like it had a purpose, a way of reminding me that the air itself was aware. I shivered, pulling my coat tighter around my shoulders, the weight of concealment pressing down like the gray light above. I traced my fingers along the edge of the stair railing, smooth and cool under trembling hands. I thought of the judge, the files, the echoes of verdicts that lingered in distant rooms. Could I ever confess without dismantling everything I had built? Could truth exist in this corridor without spilling into the rooms beyond, the courtrooms, the lives intertwined with mine? I imagined each word as a pebble, falling into water, sending ripples I could not stop, spreading into spaces I could not contain. I spoke quietly to myself, rehearsing fragments of sentences, a litany of I am S and I was S, soft and deliberate. Each one felt like a betrayal and a relief at once, tearing at the walls I had erected. I swallowed again, the lump in my throat sharp and unyielding. Shadows moved with the flickering light, brushing across the floor like silent witnesses. I could almost hear whispers in the distance, echoes of lives intertwined with my own, though no one was near. Only the building remembered. Only the walls. I rested my forehead against the stairwell wall, letting the rough plaster press against my skin. My pulse slowed a fraction, though my hands continued to tremble. The reflection in the glass caught a flicker of movement behind me. Just a shadow, I told myself, just the building breathing. But the moment reminded me how fragile this secrecy was. How easily a shadow, a glance, a word could fracture the careful illusion I had maintained for so long. I imagined someone entering, questioning, demanding, observing. Could I answer? Could I admit the truth without it spilling into judgment, into consequence, into a life I had tried to protect? I closed my eyes, hearing only the faint creak of floorboards, the hum of distant ventilation, and my own breath, uneven and deliberate. In that small, dim hallway, I confronted not just the past, but the weight of possibility, of recognition, of exposure, of truth held too long. My fingers traced the glass again, a pale outline of a hand pressed against my own reflection. I wanted to speak, wanted the confession to tumble free, wanted the weight to lift even if only slightly. But the air held it back, swallowing each attempted word, holding the secret closer than I could. And still, there was a strange relief in the act of rehearsal, of acknowledgement, even if unspoken. I had named it in my mind. I had touched it. I had confronted it. The hallway seemed to breathe with me, shifting shadows along the walls, pools of dim light stretching and bending. I imagined the building as a silent witness, a repository of truths never spoken, and I felt both comforted and exposed. My heart slowed further, but the tremor in my hands remained, a quiet insistence that some truths cannot be contained indefinitely. I pressed my palms together in my lap, feeling the cold line of my knees through the fabric of my coat, grounding myself in the small, tactile, immediate reality of the moment. I leaned back slightly, letting the reflection retreat, dimmed by flickering light. The hallway seemed endless, stretching into shadow and silence. I realized quietly that confession might always be a rehearsal, a private dialogue between myself and the memory of what I had hidden. Words unspoken still carried weight, still shaped my presence, still held me accountable in ways no courtroom ever could. I took a final slow breath, letting it fill the hollow spaces in my chest. The air smelled faintly of dust, of plaster, of cold metal from the handrail. I ran a hand along the railing one last time, tracing the worn grooves, and felt the past in miniature ridges beneath my fingers. The reflection lingered faintly in the glass, a shadow of myself that I might never release fully. And then I turned, walking slowly toward the stairwell, letting the echo of my footsteps merge with the faint hum of the building. The words remained unspoken, but their weight had shifted slightly, no lighter perhaps but acknowledged. The hallway stretched behind me, empty now, but full of memory. I realized that some truths, even when never spoken, can shape a path forward, silently, quietly, persistently. The hallway outside the private chamber smelled faintly of old wood and ink, a warm, heavy scent that pressed against my senses. I stood there for what felt like minutes, though time seemed to stretch and contract in ways I couldn't measure. My shoes scuffed softly against the worn floor, each step echoing faintly. The door loomed ahead, solid and unreadable. I ran a hand along the cool brass handle, feeling its weight, the smoothness worn by years of use. A quiet stillness surrounded me, and I wondered if even the air was holding its breath. I stepped inside when summoned. The room was smaller than the courtroom, intimate in a way that magnified every movement, every sound. Light filtered through high windows, muted by blinds, pooling across shelves lined with files, ledgers, and books whose spines were faded and fragile. The judge sat behind the desk, hands folded lightly over a sheet of paper. His eyes lifted slowly, steady, unreadable, though I sensed the weight behind them, the measured patience of someone who had seen too much and yet withheld judgment. I took a seat opposite him, careful to keep my posture neutral, my hands visible, resting lightly in my lap. I rehearsed explanations, fragments of sentences I might use, practiced lies I could tell. Each word felt like a fragile vessel, potentially shattering under the quiet scrutiny of his gaze. I imagined the past spilling from my lips, carefully selected, precise, shielded, and yet the weight of concealment pressed down, pressing me almost into the chair. The silence stretched. It was heavy, deliberate, like the pause before a verdict. The judge's hands rested lightly on the desk. He did not speak immediately. The stillness in the room seemed to pulse with subtle insistence. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the almost imperceptible creak of a hinge, the soft rustle of papers. My breath felt loud against the quiet, a fragile rhythm I tried to slow. I felt exposed yet somehow contained. His eyes followed me, steady yet without accusation. There was a calm consideration there, a sense that he had already accounted for more than I could guess. I tried to focus on the mundane. The polished surface of the desk, the neat stack of files, the faded ink on the edges of documents. Each object held the promise of distraction, grounding me in the present. But my mind drifted inevitably to what he might know, what he had pieced together, and what would happen if the carefully constructed facade I maintained collapsed. Could he sense the tremor beneath my composed exterior? Could he see the small fractures I had hidden so assiduously over decades? I imagined the file in front of him, pages marked with dates, names, places, fragments of identity I had hoped no one would recognize. Each detail felt alive, as if the ink itself could reveal more than I had intended. I swallowed, tasting the metallic edge of tension, my fingers tightening lightly in my lap. The room seemed colder suddenly, though the blinds filtered sunlight across the floor in pale streaks. I felt the quiet pressure of expectation, the unspoken understanding that my fate, or at least the next steps, rested on a conversation I had yet to have. He finally spoke, and the sound of his voice seemed measured, deliberate. "I've reviewed the documents," he said softly. No inflection betrayed judgment, no word hinted at assumption. And yet the words carried weight. The air seemed to shift around us, each syllable a pebble dropped into the still waters of the room. I nodded lightly, careful not to give anything away, though my throat felt dry, tight, unwilling to release even the simplest acknowledgement. He paused, tapping a pen against the paper, a subtle rhythm that drew out the quiet. I watched the motion closely, trying to read intention where none might exist. Every gesture seemed purposeful, yet restrained. And in that restraint, I felt both relief and dread. Relief that he did not accuse outright. Dread that the silence itself carried judgment heavier than any words could express. The weight of unspoken understanding settled around me like a blanket, suffocating in its intimacy. I imagined what might happen if I were to speak. If I confessed even a fraction of the truths I had hidden, would it change the outcome? Would the careful equilibrium of years collapse instantly under the light of acknowledgement? My fingers itched to gesture, to release the tension stored in my chest, but I stayed still, palms pressed lightly together, drawing subtle comfort from the contact. The room seemed to shrink and expand simultaneously, space bending around the quiet tension between us. The judge leaned back slightly, a small exhale escaping, barely perceptible, but enough to remind me of his human presence. I realized that this silence, this careful weighing of words and thoughts, was itself a conversation. It was a dialogue of pauses and glances, of measured breath and contained gestures. I had entered expecting confrontation, but instead found quiet deliberation, a stillness that both reassured and unnerved me. I shifted just slightly, careful not to disturb the balance. Sunlight caught a dust mote drifting lazily across the air, suspended as if waiting for permission to fall. I traced it with my eyes, letting it anchor me momentarily in the ordinary, in the tangible. And yet, the tension returned instantly, a reminder that the ordinary was fragile, that every ordinary gesture could conceal extraordinary consequences. Time seemed to stretch. The only movement was the faint rustle of paper as he adjusted a file, the soft tap of the pen, the quiet hum of the air. My heartbeat was loud in the room, a subtle drum against the stillness. And in that rhythm I realized something. The judge's silence was itself a verdict, a measure of patience and attention, a mirror for the truths I carried but could not yet speak. Finally, he looked up directly, eyes steady, not piercing, but anchored in careful observation. No accusation, no question, simply acknowledgement. The weight of that gaze was immense, and I felt the tension coiled in my chest loosen slightly, though not entirely. I exhaled softly, letting the breath travel slowly, grounding myself in the still, quiet moment. I rose when he gestured lightly, leaving the file untouched, the words unsaid. The hallway outside welcomed me with the faint scent of polished wood and dust. I walked slowly, letting the sound of my own steps merge with the quiet hum of the building. The silence behind the closed door lingered in my mind, a reminder that what had not been spoken could carry more weight than anything verbalized. And as I stepped into the muted light outside, I realized that the judge's silence was not empty. It was full of questions, full of understanding, full of patience. And I knew, quietly, that the next chapter, the next confrontation with truth, would come not with noise, but with careful listening, careful observation, and the still, deliberate passage of time. The judge cleared his throat, and the sound felt louder than it should have. Not sharp, just present. Sunlight slipped through the high window behind him, landing in thin lines across the wooden bench. Dust floated there, slow and patient, like it had nowhere else to be. I noticed my hands before I noticed his face. Folded. Too neat. The skin thinner than it used to be. The room wasn't silent. It was listening. I told myself to breathe. I told myself I had already survived worse than words. Still, my chest tightened when he finally spoke my name. I had imagined this moment 100 different ways. In some, his voice was sharp. In others, distant. Sometimes I didn't even make it to the chair. I turned around before he could look at me. But the real moment was quieter than all of that. The courtroom smelled like old paper and polish. Like history that didn't care who passed through it. The benches behind me were mostly empty. Few people shifting. A cough that tried to apologize for existing. Somewhere, a clock ticked with a patience I didn't have. I sat straight. The way you do when you've spent a lifetime practicing how not to be noticed. I thought about the life I'd built. The careful choices. The softened edges. The way I learned to answer questions without saying too much. I had told myself it was enough. That if I lived cleanly, quietly, the past would lose interest in me. Fade like an old photograph left in the sun. But sitting there under that light I felt it stir. Not loud. Not angry. Just awake. The judge didn't rush. He looked down at the file in front of him, then back at me, then down again. As if weighing something that didn't have an easy measurement. These records, he said slowly, are incomplete. The word landed gently. Almost kind. My pulse skipped anyway. He turned a page. The sound of it was soft, but it echoed in me. Each paper felt like a door I had once locked, now opening without asking. He spoke of dates, places, of decisions made long before this room existed for me. He didn't name the worst of it. Not directly. But he didn't look away either. I noticed his hands. Steady. Older than I expected. A small scar near one knuckle. It made him human in a way I hadn't prepared for. I see, he continued. A pattern of avoidance. And also, survival. That word caught. Survival. No one had called it that before. I swallowed. My mouth was dry. I wanted to say something. Anything. But my voice stayed where it was, tucked behind my ribs, holding its breath. He leaned back slightly, the chair creaking beneath him. The sound reminded me of my apartment floor at night. How it always gave me away, even when I thought I was alone. I won't pretend, he said, that the past disappears just because time has passed. I nodded before I realized I was doing it. But, he added, pausing, I also won't pretend that a life is only its worst chapters. The room felt different then. Not lighter, just less sharp. He looked at me directly. Not searching. Not accusing. Just seeing. I believe you've lived carefully, he said. Perhaps too carefully. Something loosened in my chest. Not relief exactly. More like recognition. The kind that makes your eyes sting even when you don't cry. I thought about all the times I chose silence. All the names I didn't answer to. All the truths I folded away so neatly they almost disappeared. Almost. His words didn't erase anything. They didn't forgive. They didn't condemn. They acknowledged. And somehow that was heavier and gentler than judgment. When it was over, I stood slowly. My legs felt unfamiliar, like they belonged to someone else. The bench behind me sighed as I left it, relieved to be empty. I didn't look back right away. The doors opened with a quiet resistance. Wood against wood. Outside, the light waited. Not bright. Just steady. As I stepped forward, I felt the weight shift. Not gone. Never gone. But carried differently now. Out in the open. Breathing the same air I was. For the first time in years, I wondered what it might mean to stop hiding from my own reflection. And whether the world, now knowing a little more, would still make room for me. Sunlight struck my face like a soft caress, warm and insistent, pushing through the lingering chill of early morning. The steps of the courthouse were behind me now, their shadow stretching long across the square. I paused, letting the light settle across my shoulders, across the back of my coat, as if it could press away the weight I had carried for years. The city felt different, though unchanged. Every corner familiar, yet infused with a subtle strangeness, a rhythm that acknowledged the quiet shift within me. I took a slow breath, tasting the air. Faint exhaust, coffee from a nearby cafe, the damp scent of stone warmed by sunlight. Each inhale carried a sense of calm I had not known in decades. I felt the pulse of life around me, the soft murmur of early pedestrians, the distant clang of a tram, the occasional bark of a dog. And in that ordinary symphony, I noticed the absence of tension I had long considered permanent. The secret, once crushing, now rested quietly within me, neither concealed nor openly proclaimed. My eyes drifted over the steps where the judge had once sat, watching, measuring, understanding more than I could ever articulate. I imagined his gaze, steady and deliberate, lingering faintly even now, etched into the memory of the stone. There was no accusation, no judgment lingering there, only recognition of something I had carried carefully but had now begun to release. The courthouse, with all its grandeur and shadows, felt both monumental and human, as if it too had held its breath while I made my journey within. I walked slowly along the edge of the plaza, boots brushing faint dust from the stone, feeling the subtle shift of weight in my chest. The city hummed around me, voices overlapping in a gentle cacophony, yet somehow muted, filtered through the lens of my own awareness. Faces passed, strangers with their own lives, indifferent or curious, and I realized I no longer feared recognition. Or if someone did see the truths hidden in my gaze, it no longer mattered as it once had. I thought of every corridor, every quiet hallway, every file and reflection I had confronted over the past weeks. Each had been a step toward something I had long avoided. Acknowledgement. Not just acknowledgement by others, but acknowledgement of myself. The weight I carried, secrets, rehearsed confessions, fears of exposure, had not vanished entirely, but it had shifted. It was no longer a burden pressing me into shadows. It had settled into a quiet understanding, a part of my shape, my presence, my being. I paused at the corner where sunlight fractured against the pavement, glinting on a puddle left by last night's rain. I looked down, watching the reflection of buildings ripple in the water. The distortion reminded me that perception was always partial, and yet beauty existed even in fragments. I saw my own face, softened by ripples, and smiled faintly at the recognition that I had emerged from the courthouse changed, though not entirely unscathed. The city was both familiar and foreign, and so was I. A faint wind shifted through the plaza, carrying papers from a vendor's stall in soft arcs. I watched them drift, some settling, some tumbling further into the square. There was a rhythm in it, a lesson perhaps, in letting things fall where they may, in observing without grasping. I felt a resonance with that rhythm, a quiet acceptance that the truths I carried, revealed or concealed, could coexist with the world outside. I could coexist with them, finally. I moved along the street, boots echoing faintly on the stone, every sound deliberate and grounding. People passed, some glancing, some unaware, each immersed in their own currents. I felt neither need nor desire to explain, to justify, to cloak myself in pretense. The release I experienced was quiet, subtle, not triumphant in a loud sense, but internal, intimate, and lasting. A chapter closed within me even as the city continued around me, indifferent yet generous in its ordinary continuity. I thought of the judge one last time, imagining the quiet strength in his eyes, the patience of someone who had held the weight of others' truths without rush or condemnation. The echo of his gaze lingered, not as judgment, but as acknowledgement, a reminder that some truths, when held steady and carefully, need no fanfare. And yet, even in release, I felt the twinge of awareness that observation never ends entirely. Someone might notice, someone might look away. But it no longer dictated my steps or my presence. The air smelled faintly of damp stone and warm asphalt, sun-warmed and yielding. I felt the light in a way I had not before, settling into the contours of my face, my hands, the edges of my coat. Every step felt deliberate, but free, a movement guided by the rhythm of quiet certainty rather than fear. I paused at a crosswalk, watching cars roll by, pedestrians moving in careful choreography, and felt myself as part of the living pulse of the city, no longer a shadow navigating corridors of memory and secrecy. I glanced back once more at the grand steps of the courthouse. The stone looked less imposing in sunlight, softened by shadows that stretched long and pale. I imagined the secrets held within, not gone but transformed, integrated into the narrative of my life. The weight I carried had not disappeared. It had become a companion rather than a chain. I let the memory settle, a quiet echo that moved with me rather than against me. As I stepped into the flow of the city, the sunlight bright against my face, I felt the first true sense of openness in years. Not freedom in a loud, declarative way, but in the intimate knowledge that the past, the secrets, the careful rehearsals, had shifted. They had not vanished, but they no longer constrained. I walked with the quiet awareness that the world might see fragments of who I am, and that was enough. The city moved around me, ordinary and vivid, indifferent and persistent. And I moved within it, lighter than before, carrying the quiet release of truth acknowledged, even partially, even subtly. My steps carried both caution and courage, a rhythm both new and familiar. The courthouse faded behind me, its shadows softened by distance, its gaze no longer immediate but echoing in the sunlight that warmed my face. And as I continued forward, blending into the motion of the city, I realized that the mystery I had carried was not gone. It would linger, as all truths do, shaping moments, perceptions, interactions. But I was ready now, to meet it openly, to let it exist without consuming me. Who would notice? Who would turn away? I did not need the answer. The quiet release within me was already enough to move forward.